I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to Bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare, anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Courtney.
We did it again. We just jump into talking like, hi, how are you doing? But really, hello, Elise. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty okay. It is like 50 degrees here, so it's cold. I've got like a heating pad. It all of a sudden got like so cold as I was finishing up my reading, and I was like, I don't have time to like put a space heater on in this room and not have it come through on the recording. So that's what we're doing. I've also got like cup of hot coffee just to help keep warm. How are you doing?
I'm in the opposite world of you because here in LA,
isn't it like 80 degrees?
It's warm. I have my cold brew, and it's a sunny day in Los Angeles, even though it's the middle of January. So that's our weather update, listeners.
Yeah. Just to like transition away from our weather, we are going to actually be talking about Shakespeare's depictions of honorable men and virtuous women in Julius Caesar, specifically looking closely at the characters of Brutus and Portia. But before we get into that, we do have some housekeeping because longtime listeners will know that we take a little break in December. So we have a few things to catch up on, specifically thanking our new Patreon patrons. We had quite a few. So from the bottom of our hearts, thanks, and ever thanks to JJ Luria,
Martin,
Sid,
Ricky Meza,
and Giorgio DePaolo for joining our Patreon patron community in December and January. And if you would like to join our Patreon community, we have been celebrating Shakespeare Anyone's 5th birthday this month of January by offering 50% off your first month of a paid tier of our Patreon membership. The code to join is HBD5. That's HBD5, like Happy Birthday 5. We have that running until the end of the month, so there's only a few more days to grab your first month of bonus episodes, ad-free episodes, blog posts from us, and joining the really fun community we've got going on over there on Patreon.
And in addition to that, Shakespeare Anyone podcast is a listener-funded, independently produced podcast. And so joining the community will help us continue to expand the work that we do. Hey, Elise.
Yeah, Courtney?
That's a nice mug you got there.
Oh, thank you, Courtney. This is, of course, my Shakespeare Anyone merch mug. It's got our Shakespeare from our podcast art, and on the back it says, "We'll teach you to drink deep ere you depart," from Hamlet. And another thing that we did over the past couple months is quietly launch a few new pieces of merch. These are things that just pop into our heads, Shakespeare merch that we want to see, that we can't find anywhere else, and then we design it in-house and then bring it to you. So if you want to check out what we've designed over the past few months, head to shakespeareanyone.com/shop to check out all of our merch designs. Also, this is a giant cup. It's like the size of my face. I love it so much.
Yeah, you can get a giant mug for your hot beverages if you have cold weather like Elise, or you can get a beautiful glass tumbler for your cold beverages if you have warm weather like me in LA. So there are options for everyone.
Yeah. And with that, stay with us a little bit longer. We have some just general content warnings for this episode. In this episode, we are going to be discussing some gender roles that are depicted in Shakespeare's play and how they've been portrayed over the course of history. We know at Shakespeare Anyone podcast that gender is not a binary. However, we will be using some binary language to correspond with the sources that we are using and referencing during this episode.
Yeah, we know that gender is a construct, but Shakespeare's play was writing within the binary. And so, in order to discuss these plays and men and women, we have to engage with the binary. But if you are interested in looking at episodes that go beyond the binary, we do have episodes in our back catalog that talk about Shakespeare, gender roles, and we've interviewed scholars who look at Shakespeare's work through early modern trans studies and other sorts of lenses that are not so restrictive. But for today's episode, unfortunately,
it may be a little restrictive.
Restrictive. We're confined by the binary.
Yeah, as are these characters. And last but not least, we are discussing the character of Brutus, and we are discussing Portia. And during our discussion today, we will be discussing topics of self-harm and suicide. Please listen with care, and if you are in crisis, please call, text, or chat with the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988, or contact the crisis text line by texting TALK to 741741.
Thank you, Elise, for that really important trigger warning.
Yeah, and we will do our best to let you know when we are about to discuss those topics. If they are not for you, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's dive into today's episode. As you mentioned at the top of the episode, we are talking about honorable men and virtuous women in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Why are we going to be looking at specifically the characteristics of being honorable and virtuous?
Well, as we've previously discussed in episodes about honor and virtue and gender roles in Shakespeare's time, these topics of honor and virtue are sort of gendered versions of the same idea, what it means to be a good person in Shakespeare's time, right? And this is also a theme that Shakespeare explores in many plays, but specifically in Julius Caesar, certain characters are particularly called out or called on for being honorable or virtuous, and honor and virtue are major players that move this plot along.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the big things we're going to tackle with, especially with your research, is Brutus an honorable man?
Yeah, we hear it multiple times throughout the play of Brutus is an honorable man, and my reading is really looking at the question of, is Brutus an honorable man, and what makes him or doesn't make him an honorable man? I'm first going to start off with my reading from Xinyao Zhao's Oxymoronic Ethos, the Rhetoric of Honor and its Performance in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And in this article, Zhao discusses that in Act 1, Scene 2, basically the start of our play, Cassius persuades Brutus to join the cause against Caesar by playing on recognizing Brutus's virtue and that he can see this invisible quality of honor shining through Brutus from both Brutus's inner character and tying it to Brutus's family line, that Brutus is just known for his honor. And Brutus also declares that, quote, the appeal of an honorable name outweighs his fear for death, unquote. So Brutus cares more than anything about honor. And then Cassius creates this story of weighing the names of Caesar and Brutus together and depicting Caesar, who is sort of this paragon of men in Rome at this point, this god amongst men, to the very human Brutus, and which one is more worthy, manlike, honorable. Cassius's story basically sums up a way of tackling the anxiety we've talked about before in the Renaissance and early modern period of the disconnect between one's exterior and one's interior. We talked about this with Macbeth, we've talked about this with Hamlet, we've talked about, that you can present one thing and internally be thinking and feeling another, that outward public behavior is visible but can be performative and potentially fraudulent.
Yeah, and the conspirators, specifically Brutus tells all the conspirators that you're going to basically be an actor. Like, we shouldn't hide away. We should be out smiling and engaging with people, even though we're going to do this. We need to pretend like we're great, even though we're plotting to kill Caesar.
Yeah. And again, this is something that Shakespeare explores throughout many plays. We get it in Macbeth of look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. False face must hide what the false heart doth know. So Cassius tells Brutus that Brutus's outward expression, the way he walks through the world, mirrors what everyone knows to be true inside of Brutus, that Brutus is perfectly aligned with his honor. He is honorable inside and out. It is not an act for him, is what Cassius says to Brutus, and then this sort of becomes the fatal flaw for Brutus, his hamartia, the thing that is going to bring him down is this belief that he is, inside and outside, a honorable man. Zhao argues that this honor is oxymoronic, and that, quote, honor as an oxymoron is symptomatic of a more general anxiety about rhetoric, which Shakespeare's Julius Caesar uses as an experimental space, rehearses, and evaluates. The play dramatizes an arena where people use rhetorical performance to vie for dominance over their peers and the mob, which involves simulation and dissimulation, deception, and sometimes even self-deception, unquote. So in the space of Julius Caesar, we see, and I will dive into these a little bit more later, the dual sides of rhetoric, that rhetoric can be persuasive and it can be performative and it can cause people to do things. Like, we're going to get into the scene of Brutus and Antony's speeches and their effectiveness a little bit later. But that's like the key scene of an anxiety about rhetoric in Shakespeare's time. It can be duplicitous. And I think this also, like, sidebar, this ties back to things that we've talked about in terms of the education system in Shakespeare's England was one where young men were taught to argue both sides of an argument. So just because somebody is saying something very eloquently doesn't mean that's actually the truth or what they believe. They can just be very skilled at arguing the opposite side of an argument.
Mm-hmm.
Brutus as a character repeatedly pushes his fellow Romans to be consistent and works to maintain constancy, this value of, again, that alignment between the inner self and the outer self. This is, quote, equivalent to living up to their innate nature, unquote. But starting in 2:1, we start to see cracks in Brutus's exterior as he's tormented by a, quote, most fervid and deep-seated jealousy, unquote. In 2:1, when he's sort of arguing with himself over whether or not to kill Caesar, he combines metaphor with hypothetical ideas throughout his speech, all while using the frameworks of a logical argument. Zhao says that, quote, Brutus's use of metaphor to prove a hypothesis is itself logically invalid. Metaphors are a circuitous form of argumentation, for they assume an arbitrary correlation between the tenor and the vehicle, and often employ the conclusion to prove its own premise, unquote. And thus, he convinces himself that he has logically and rationally come to the conclusion that Caesar must die, because he has convinced himself that the metaphors he is using prove the hypothetical future that he's envisioning. It's like ChatGPT-induced psychosis.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's like a self-talk of like, it's self-serving self-talk.
Mm-hmm.
Find whatever's going to validate what you're trying to get to. And
Yes.
ChatGPT psychosis is the perfect modern
equivalent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Then I'm going to dig into that a little bit more of like his inward and outward struggle. He then, uses honor as his only credential when he's talking to the plebeians. He's basically like, believe me because you know I'm honorable. He offers no proof of why Caesar was a tyrant. He is just, people say stoically, like, here are facts. I'm going to get into him in just a minute. Is he a stoic or not? But this sort of honor, and you should believe me because I am honorable and you trust me, is what Antony undercuts in his speech by repeatedly reminding the audience that Brutus is honorable, but Antony has all this proof against what Brutus is saying. In contrast to Brutus's idea that he is both inside and outside, honorable, constant, true, Antony owns that he is a chameleon and that he is self-constructing his public persona. He's also not the play's ideal orator. Antony's success is overshadowed by Octavius, who ends up preferring action to words and has little interest in rhetoric. So we could say that this play is just very anti-rhetoric and you cannot believe what politicians are saying, you have to believe what they're doing. So I'm going to dig into a little bit more now about the character of Brutus and try to answer the question of, he believes himself to be this stoic ideal. What does that mean? And is he that person? So my next reading is a chapter from Patrick Gray's Shakespeare and the Fall of the Roman Republic, Selfhood, Stoicism, and the Civil War. This is the conclusion to part 1, Shakespeare's Passion Play chapter. So Gray agrees with Zhao that Brutus is set up as this stoic ideal, which is known as the sapiens, or the wise man, the sage, who always does what he should. Stoics believed at a very high level, maybe we will get into more like nitty-gritty later in a few months, they had this like golden rule of bear and forbear. And the ideal was this like wise sage who is just sort of unbothered, always able to remain nonplussed. This is similar to like the Christian ideal of the golden rule and the exemplar being Christ. Or for Buddhists, the Eightfold Path, the exemplar is Buddha. So for Stoics, bear and forbear, the ideal is this sage character. And that's sort of what Brutus is told he is, and told it's very obvious to everybody else that that's who he is, that he is the wise sage Stoic. However, while Shakespeare's Brutus is very invested in his image as the Stoic sapiens, he repeatedly just does not act like one. Gray notes that, one, Brutus's concern for the common good, which Antony praises him for, is, quote, incompatible with the Stoic ideal of indifference, unquote. Additionally, Gray notes that, quote, under pressure, Brutus occasionally sets aside his performance of the Stoic indifference, revealing emotions such as pity, grief, and anger. Unfortunately, however, he is only willing to let down his guard in private. This concern for his public reputation as a philosopher is much of the reason why his funeral oration is not more successful. He is not willing to be passionate in public as Antony is. Instead, he tries to sway his audience through arid, impersonal argument, unquote. So, Shakespeare's Brutus is constantly performing the role of the Stoic wise man in public, and then his private behavior shows us that that's not actually who he is, even though Cassius has told him that's what he is. Here are some examples of that. After hearing that Portia is dead, he calls for a bowl of wine, which calls back to Cassius's accusation outside of Brutus's tent a scene before, in which Cassius says, quote, Brutus, this sober form of yours hides wrongs, unquote. Brutus is not sober. A scene later. And he repeatedly hides wrongs. Quote, he is more prone to emotional breakdown than he lets on. His studied persona of indifference is form rather than substance. And then another example of sort of Brutus's behavior that is not Stoic, that is not the Stoic ideal, is, and content warning, I am now going to be talking about the suicide of Cato. So skip ahead if that is not for you. So my third article for our third example of how Brutus is actually not the Stoic wise man that he pretends to be is his thoughts on suicide. This comes from Mark Sakharov's Suicide and Brutus's Philosophy in Julius Caesar. So in 5.1, Brutus expresses his thoughts on suicide after Cato's death. Brutus blames Cato for Cato's death and says that, quote, even by the rule of that philosophy by which I did blame Cato for the death which he did give himself, I know not how, but I do find it cowardly and vile for fear of what might fall, so to prevent the time of life arming myself with patience to stay the providence of some high powers that govern us below, unquote. So Brutus is repulsed by Cato's choice to kill himself, by Cato's choice to die by suicide, and editors have long misidentified this as Stoicism, when in fact, according to Sakharov, quote, the most famous Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, maintain that death by one's own hand is always an option and frequently more honorable than a life of protracted misery, unquote. Historically, young Cato was a character in Plutarch who was Brutus's uncle and in whose footsteps Brutus closely followed. This is a character that Shakespeare's audience would have been familiar with as, one, they would have known the invocation of Cato and known of the historical Cato who was also a Stoic and sort of a model of Stoical belief and as close to the wise man as the historical Stoics got. Therefore, Brutus's speech can't be like a Stoic take on suicide. So it is possible that instead, well, one, it again is another crack in Brutus's veneer of Stoicism, this act that he's putting on. Clearly his internal thoughts do not agree with the Stoic beliefs. But additionally, since Cato was sort of a leading symbol for this sort of like democratic republicanism against a Caesarism, this would have rhymed a little bit with the monarchism of Elizabethan England in 1599. And therefore Cato as this sort of rebel archetype has to be depicted in the wrong for Shakespeare.
So for clarity purposes, you're saying historically in early modern Shakespeare's time, like the Elizabethan period, because of Elizabeth and the monarchy, the like rebel has to be the bad guy because of the idea of the monarch, the divine, and like, so for example, Essex is...
Yes. We can't have Brutus be like, Cato knew what was up. This serves a dual purpose, is what I'm saying, of both, again, showing that Brutus is not the Stoic he pretends to be, because he does not align with this Cato who was an ideal Stoic. And furthermore, it makes sure that in his last moments, Brutus is separating himself from the rebels who are against this authoritarian
Right.
government of Caesar.
That could have been maybe
been a
perceived as
parallel.
Elizabeth.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So all of that to say, when Brutus is told that he is a honorable man and that his honor shines through him, and when we see him be stoic, it is more of an act and more of how Cassius is playing on Brutus's desire to be perceived as a stoic, as the sapien, the sage, the wise man, versus Brutus's actual character. So, is Brutus actually honorable? Well, so to tie it all back, with the Elizabethan anxieties of the difference of how you can present yourself versus your actual inner motives and thoughts, Brutus is much more would have probably been seen as not an honorable man. And I would say actually much like Macbeth, where Macbeth's folly is ambition, Brutus's folly is believing himself to be more honorable than he is.
The irony of Brutus's trajectory is also like at the end, he is being called honorable. Like Messala, Antony, Octavius all basically say, like, of all the conspirators, Brutus was noble and we need to bury him honorably.
Right.
But maybe to the audience, if the audience is familiar with the rhetoric and the history and those things that you're mentioning, they're able to be like, that's not true. And that there's,
I think it's also that like Messala and Antony and Octavius he did act out of want for the better good. However, that desire for the better good was not in alignment with who he was pretending to be. And so it's in alignment with what they see as honorable, which is the greater good, right? And they are also, men of, we've got Octavius, who is a character of action. And then we've got Antony, who can utilize rhetoric to get what he wants and shows how rhetoric can be manipulative. And so they do acknowledge that, like, in his desire for what he considered to be for the greater good, that's where they find Brutus honorable, but not in his presentation of stoicism. And at the end, only in death is he found honorable, because they can say that what he did was not out of self-interest.
Even if he wasn't a stoic, even if he was putting on a facade, he was still honorable because of that, doing this for the common good of Rome.
I think that's what I'm trying to say,
Yeah. I find that fascinating because if we look at the afterlife of Julius Caesar, if we look at the afterlife of Brutus, there are these like 100, 200 years where Brutus is just mostly assumed to be honorable and a stoic. And when you actually look at the text and you actually look at stoicism, which we're putting a pin in a full examination of that.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that, and maybe to Shakespeare's audiences, they would have understood what you're talking about, the research you brought into this episode.
Yeah, so Shakespeare's audiences would have been, again, very familiar with specifically Seneca, who was one of these Stoic philosophers. They would have been familiar with the beliefs of Stoicism. They would have had these anxieties about people saying things that they don't mean and pretending to be someone that they're not. And they also would have known from that very popular translation of Plutarch, they would have known a little bit of the history of Rome and who these people were. And Plutarch specifically is like a lot of characterization. I think we talked about that in Stuff to Chew On, Brutus being an honorable person. So I think it's also, that ending is also Shakespeare being like, he's still the Brutus we all have heard about. But where his honor came from maybe isn't, his stoicism, his indifference, or his rebellion.
Yeah. I think in order to successfully pull off a rebellion, you have to have an opinion about something.
You can't be indifferent. Yeah, like doing an assassination does not make you indifferent.
Yeah.
So that's how Brutus's honor can be read through and sort of unpacked. The noble, honorable man who gets deceived and manipulated and then ends in tragedy. And we can also see that, like, he can also be duplicitous himself.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the flip side of honor is, in terms of gendered ideas and ideals of the early modern era, is virtue. And you have some research you were telling me about that focuses on Brutus's counterpart, Portia.
Yeah.
And how she has been depicted as virtuous throughout history. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah. My research is from an article, Portia and the Circulation of Virtue. Men May Construe Things After Their Fashion by Sarah K. Scott. And this article by Scott essentially analyzes the editorial commentary and the editors who attempt to correct other editors' quote unquote errors as it pertains to Portia and her virtue in Julius Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
And so this article really is looking at the afterlife of Julius Caesar and looking at how editors, commentators, theater makers essentially make corrections, what they view as quote unquote corrections to the quote unquote errors of the text and how that impacts Portia and specifically her as a virtuous woman. First, before I get into the nuts and bolts of it, Scott does write that seeking correct or definitive solutions to textual problems may be less useful than trying to determine what various reading communities thought was worth investigating and why critical controversies about them arose. So this is a commentary on editors and the history of correcting textual problems rather than engaging with them and really investigating what makes
why
exactly.
I'm so excited. I love this.
Yeah. It's especially because we talked about in our Stuff to Chew On, we've talked about just in general how Julius Caesar has this massive afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
It was popular in Shakespeare's time, but it also just is one of those plays that has from day one, basically like every decade, every century, this play is a part of Western pop culture. And then later, like academia and, institutional blah, 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 blah. But the commentary surrounding Portia in Julius Caesar's scholarship started around the Enlightenment period. So that's roughly 1687 to 1789, when various readings and performance practices of Shakespeare's plays were being introduced. And Michael Dobson, shout out to my professor at Shakespeare Institute, is quoted as calling these origins now, quote unquote, virtually invisible to us in present day. So there's a lot of things that we accept at face value, even though they are the result of hundreds of years of creating new readings based on that time period's sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And editors seem to be focused on correcting each other's errors in two places in the Portia Brutus scene, starting with Alexander Pope's 1725 edition of Shakespeare's play. And in his edition, Pope has beef with the word charm and comfort in Act 2, Scene 1.
Of course he does.
Yes. Eye roll, everybody. And editors were strongly influenced by ideas of gender and their beliefs about women and the standards for women's behavior and morality. And because of this, Pope substituted the word charge for charm when Portia implores Brutus to share his secret with her. So essentially, Brutus isn't saying what is on his mind. He's not sharing with his wife what's grieving him. Why is he in the garden at
2 a.m. or
2 a.m. walking around being really contemplative.
Come to bed. Why aren't you coming to bed? Yeah.
And in the first folio, Portia uses the word charm, but Pope doesn't like this and changes charm to charge. And Scott notes that using the word charm does imply or carry notions of flirting, romance, and beauty for, Portia to charm her husband into sharing.
Alexander Pope can't have that.
No, he can't. He cannot. For Pope, Shakespeare's Roman matron, quote, could not partake of his own coquettish, feminine creations in any way whatsoever, unquote. Therefore, the word charge might be more appropriate to him as an action that's more austere versus flirtatious. And so this was Pope's editorial correction of what he saw was a textual flaw. I know, isn't it goofy?
Oh, let me just change this verb and completely change how an actor would play this line.
Mm-hmm. And Scott posits that the choice was made due to the fact that Pope was influenced and bought into the Enlightenment era notion of womanly decorum. So Portia could not be charming or use her wiles on her husband. She was the daughter of Cato, who was a statesman. And so Pope describes Cato as Rome's, quote, last good man, unquote, and, quote, virtue confessed in human shape, unquote, in a prologue he wrote for Joseph Addison's Cato in 1713.
The Cato I was just talking about.
Yep.
Yeah.
And because of this, there's no way that Portia could be virtuous and be
And
charming
flirty.
and flirty and with her husband.
Guess what, girls? You cannot be both.
Yeah, impossible. And it's funny because Pope's contemporaries, on the other hand, understood that Portia had possessed this charm that Pope implies Shakespeare could not have attributed to her. And so an English translation of Francois Bruis's The Art of Knowing Women, or The Female Sex Dissected, which was published in 1730, recounts an episode when the orator Quintus Hortensius Horotulus approaches Cato and proposed that, even though Portia is married with 2 children, she be borrowed for the sake of propagating virtue. So in this like section of The Art of Knowing Women, in this like retelling of this scene, Portia is described as, quote, a fruitful, productive soil, unquote, and a, quote, fruitful field of a young woman, unquote, who's to be used on loan as a, quote, communication of women among honest people, causing a circulation of virtue, unquote. So, listeners, there's confusion on Elisa's face.
Go on.
So the point of bringing in this other understanding of virtue, and by the way, for the record, Cato did not move forward with the proposition in the retelling of this scene, but this anecdote shows that there were many different beliefs about how virtue could be circulated beyond Pope's Enlightenment-inspired bounds. So even though we here at Shakespeare Anyone podcast don't agree with associating Portia as alone to go populate and circulate more virtue, the point of this is just that like Pope had such a narrow idea of virtue.
Pope was like, virtue means no sex.
No sex.
Absolutely sexless. And then there's another, what you're saying is like, there's also another view that's like, actually, she should have the most.
Yes.
And like be for hire so that she can have more children and populate the world.
Yeah.
Literally with virtue.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought I was understanding. And I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. How else
Okay.
can we circulate virtue amongst Roman people? Yes, virtuous women are having sex with multiple men to have multiple children. Therefore, lots of virtuous babies.
Okay.
Or rather, future
Virtuous Romans.
Yeah. But the reason that Pope changed the word from charm to charge is it's an attempt to proclaim virtue on his terms rather than on Portia's, rather than on the language that Shakespeare used and the publishers of the folio put into the folio. And Scott suggests that even during this time period, the Enlightenment, there were early feminist writers who would have questioned Pope's editorial choice and maybe detected that this is a sign of male control and censorship of female speech. For example, as early as 1697, there was an early feminist writer named Mary Astell who wrote A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, which called for virtuous living through rising above male censorship through reasoned discourse. So while Pope is like censoring Portia, women of the time period are like, no, like
Calling it out.
in order to be virtuous, we have to be engaged in reasoned discourse. But even though Pope did substitute charge for charm, this substitution was not extensive. It was adopted by some editors who were like-minded, mostly conservative rightists. And some of those were Reverend Henry N. Hudson, William Sidney Walker, and Benjamin Gott Kinnear. But it wasn't widely adopted. And Kinnear, he justified that charm is a power that Portia does not possess, and that charge is more wifely. So the people who were changing this, who agreed with Pope, were people who had the same kind of conservative rightist ideas that he
about
had.
How women should behave. Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the reasons for challenging or like changing Portia from someone who charms her husband to someone who charges her husband is perhaps he didn't want stoic Brutus succumbing to Portia's allure, which is a funny question to ask considering what we just learned about Brutus
How
as a
stoic
stoic.
is Brutus. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, like I said, this wasn't widely distributed, and there are other editors like Louis Theobald, George Stevens, George Lee Craik, John Hunter, and Sir Mark Hunter who followed the first folio, which used the word charm. They followed the first folio. So during this time period from the Enlightenment on, most editors used the word charm. They didn't use the substituted charge, but they also didn't really explicitly discuss Portia's sexuality. It wasn't until the 20th century when editors made explicit references to the idea that Shakespeare portrays Portia as a sexually attractive woman. So that is the evolution, the kind of full circle of charm. But there is another quote unquote correction to a quote unquote error in Shakespeare's first folio that Pope and others had changed. Comfort was also seen as an error and substituted by some editors. And this also demonstrates editors' unease with the idea of Portia as a sensual, sensible, and honorable wife. So Louis Theobald, who didn't adopt Pope's charm, did correct comfort. So Theobald, quote unquote, corrects the phrase comfort your bed to consort your bed.
How is that better?
I don't. Well, we've got some reasoning.
Okay.
So, and consort your bed, basically keep company or, being a partner in wedded relations. It's a lot more sterile.
Okay.
But his reasoning is that comfort is, quote, an odd phrase and gives an odd idea, unquote. And so he substituted the word consort for comfort to make it, quote, much more proper, unquote. But he's also really silent on what comfort might imply. And he also goes out of his way to say that he thinks Shakespeare meant to use a different word. So, so even though Theobald, who's a very famous editor of Shakespeare's plays, made this change, his editorial successors do retain the folio reading, although they are also equally silent on what comfort may imply. Other editors of other texts from Shakespeare's time understood charm to imply intimacy, and so this meaning was at odds with the matriarchal, charmless conception of Portia. And then North's translation of Plutarch similarly implies comfort as a euphemism for bedfellow and companion in a marital, conjugal, sexual sense. So these editors are not really addressing what these words might mean or anything like that. But
so it's like, there's I think
Mm-hmm.
this is a mistake because it doesn't make sense to me and my understanding of Portia, even though we can go back and say well, Plutarch used these words.
Yes.
In the similar sense to Shakespeare. They're just I'm uncomfortable with the idea of Portia and Brutus having marital relations of any sort, and so I'm putting them. It's like the editorial equivalent of putting them in the 1950s television married couple twin beds.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. I'm uncomfortable with this, so I'm going to change it. But then all around me are all these other contemporary writers of Shakespeare's and editors who are contemporaries to Theobald and Pope who are using the words the way that we would understand them.
Mm-hmm.
But because it doesn't match with Pope and Theobald's sensibilities, Shakespeare's wrong. And the other editors.
Oh, yeah. Shakespeare's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are two problems that editors have had beef with. And
some big editors, Alexander Pope's a big influential editor. So it's not and Theobald is influential. And I think it's what's interesting though is, as you point out, that they are influential, but these changes don't last long and not everybody agrees with them.
No.
And these editors were in these instances, these choices were not popular.
No, they were not popular. In this next section, I'm going to be talking about self-harm. So if you are uncomfortable with this or this is not for you, go ahead and skip ahead. So another problem that editors have had and have made quote unquote corrections to is Portia's wound. So Portia stabs herself in the thigh when she is telling Brutus she is constant and she deserves to know his secrets. He should tell her as his wife, all that kind of stuff. She does this as this statement, but this is something that editors of a certain sensibility have had problems with and have had to work around or change. And so Portia's wound in the thigh, it can be seen as something that's intimate or psychosexual. It can be seen as a divergence from or conduciveness to Stoic matronly virtue. But rather than actually addressing the text, a lot of editors were unwilling to explain or confront it. Starting with Dryden and Davenant's adaptation of Julius Caesar, which we've talked about Dryden and Davenant in other episodes. And these are two 18th century theater makers. And we've talked about their adaptations of other Shakespeare works, but they adapted Julius Caesar and they put the self-inflicted injury in the arm rather than the thigh. And then in the early 20th century, critics tended to mention simply the wound and not the thigh. And this is likely due to women's clothing and the indecency that was seen to Victorians and Edwardians. And even major film adaptations omit the wound entirely. However, even though these influential male theater makers, directors made these theatrical changes, early women commentators don't share the early male editors' issues with Portia's wound or how she proves her virtue. For example, Bolognese painter Elisabetta Serrani's Baroque painting, Portia Wounding Her Thigh from 1664, depicts the act. And if you pull it up and look at it, the painting shows a physically unaffected Portia in a moment of fortitude with her skirt up and she has stabbed her thigh. And this woman painter doesn't have the same kind of issue with this sensibility of virtuous women can't do this. And that's in contrast to with Ercole di Roberti's 15th century panel, which shows Portia's wound on her foot. So these are just two examples of like artists who, one being a woman, one being a man, had different reactions to or opinions
or comfort
levels with Portia's wound on her thigh.
Mm-hmm.
And overall, no evidence remains about women complaining about Portia's sexuality or wound in relation to her being an honorable woman. And fun fact, Abigail Adams adopted Portia's name as her nom de plume in letters to her husband during the American Revolution. And even the first woman editor of Shakespeare, Henrietta Maria Bowdler, in her The Family Shakespeare from 1807, which was full of really heavy-handed censorship, did not correct the words charm or comfort or change the self-inflicted wound for her conservative reading community. So there seems to be a different comfort with Portia and her virtue, the language, her actions, if you're a man versus a woman.
Or a different desire to censor if you're a man versus a woman, yeah.
Yes. And the first extended commentary on the wound, on Portia's wound, appears in Characteristics of Women, Moral, Poetical, and Historical from 1832 by early feminist Anna Brownell Jameson. And her work, quote, examines Shakespeare's women to identify mistaken principles of a society whose customs do much to limit women through a manner of social, political, and educational systems, unquote. So essentially rebukes the critics' mistakes about Shakespeare's women. For example, Portia, and how since Pope, there has been censorship and there has been change to Portia based on censoring Shakespeare's women. For Jameson, Portia is praised as a natural woman who is passionate and demure, strong-willed and chaste. She has passionate and profound feeling, softness and timidity, self-discipline, stately dignity, and Portia's self-inflicted wound is the strongest proof of her disposition. Now, I do want to note, and Scott points out, that Jameson, while she's asking readers to deepen their understanding of what a woman could be, she is still upholding gendered stereotypes by leaning into the softness, timidity, all of that. But regardless, unlike Pope and Theobald and other male editors who changed the language to change what it meant for Portia to be virtuous, Jameson is like, no, this wound is proof of her disposition as virtuous. And as we move into the 20th century, it is important to note that there are changes in how society views women and sexuality. For example, in 1918, Marie Snopes' Married Love criticizes the attitudes that pure women should be above enjoying a sex life. So up until this point, there's been a lot of compartmentalizing, as we were discussing earlier, that pure women, virtuous women can't enjoy sex. So how could Portia charm her husband? How could they be engaged in sex and have a sex life if she's a pure, virtuous woman? And as we get into the 20th century, this perspective of women, virtue is changing. And in the middle of the 20th century, scholarship is influenced by psychoanalytical criticism, gender studies, and second-wave feminism. And this time period begins to address the previous omission of Portia as a sexually realized being. And I'm not going to get into the different psychoanalytical perspectives of Portia from this time period. Many of them are inspired by Freud. So you can let your imagination run wild with what that means. But I want to move on to some other things that are a bit more pertinent to what
And you can listen to our episode from our King Lear series on Shakespeare's influence on early psychiatry to hear more about how Freud used Shakespeare to validate his theories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Elise. So moving on, it isn't until 1998 when David Daniels' edition of Julius Caesar theorizes that Shakespeare may have known the Greek adjective philostorgos, which means loving wisdom, and that Plutarch used this to describe Portia's feelings for Brutus. And this loving wisdom is both amorous and has erotic connotations. And also in David Daniels' edition, he also writes that Portia claims she is Brutus's equal. In spite of all of this, Scott also notes that the conversation about Portia and her virtue and, her relationship with Brutus is, quote, woefully absent in most of the stage history of the play, unquote. And she notes John Ripley's study from 1599 to 1973 and Andrew James Hartley's recent production in 2016 show that the focus in production remains on Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius, and other big scenes like the assassination and the mob, etc., etc. So even though from the Enlightenment up until now, there's this changing, evolving conversation about Portia, her virtue, what it means to be an honorable woman, that isn't really, or I guess rather, that's not necessarily tackled in the stage history since the focus is on the triad.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that Scott does tackle in the latter part of her article is the theatrical changes to the text that we've talked about behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to all the editorial changes that are made by editors, theater makers make theatrical changes that influence these characters and these plays. And so one of them that's really dominant in the last 25 years or so is portraying Portia as pregnant. And so Scott writes about a couple of different instances of theater companies choosing to portray Portia as pregnant and the effect that that has. And there's no textual evidence to suggest that Portia is with child.
Yeah.
But the 2001 Georgia Shakespeare Festival dramaturg named Hartley, I don't know if that's that dramaturg's first or last name. The complete name of this dramaturg wasn't noted in the article, but this dramaturg, Hartley, said that the effect strengthened the relationship between husband and wife and justified Portia's weak condition. And Scott challenges this by asking why pregnancy would be seen as a weakness when it is possibly the greatest form of female empowerment. And this is not Scott's thinking, this is just my own, is like, I don't want to go into a binary discussion of whether or not pregnancy makes you strong or weak, but I appreciate her challenging this idea that if you're pregnant,
it's inherently weak.
Exactly. Yeah. But what this also does is, in addition to like viewing pregnancy as being a weakness, by making Portia with child, that means that Portia wounds herself and commits suicide while pregnant, which seems unlikely for Cato's daughter and Brutus's wife. And Scott suggests that this choice is an overcorrection to Pope and other editors, in spite of it not having any basis in the text or any of Shakespeare's sources.
It also feels like an attempt to directly contrast Portia with Calpurnia, who is textually dealing with infertility.
Which there's nothing we like more than pitting two women against each other. Turning them into dichotomies of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even though, as Scott points out, and as we've discussed, there's no textual support for making Portia pregnant, audiences seeing Portia with child have remarked that it's effective for humanizing Portia's problems and her relationship with Brutus, which, yeah. Yeah. So presenting Portia as pregnant in another way, like pregnancy becomes the thing that symbolizes her virtue and or her sexuality, as well as her constancy to Brutus, which means that the pregnancy sometimes replaces the wound in the thigh as the symbol of constancy. And in fact, in some productions, like just like the movies, theater makers omit the wound in the thigh completely. And Scott notes that this theatrical change, similarly to the editors who make those textual changes in print, is another kind of correcting Shakespeare in a way that has changed what some would call the truths of the play. And there are two examples of this kind of new truth for the play. One is that the Cambridge School Shakespeare asks readers to consider the significance of Portia with child, basing the question on an unnamed production. And that's not even in the text. That's a production choice.
That's like what changes if she's...
Yeah. And then there's a 2008 manga edition of the play that features Portia as pregnant, and it does also have a gash in her right thigh. But the point is just that this theatrical change, this quote unquote correction, has created a new truth for the play that, like, similar to those editors who've changed charm and have changed comfort, have also changed the wound in the thigh into something totally new. And Scott concludes that by refiguring Portia, editors and theater makers devalue and devitalize her character through interpretations influenced by their surroundings rather than the history of Rome, like the Roman history that would have inspired like the environment of these characters or the text itself.
Yeah.
So the question of, you know, the flip side of the male honor and the being the woman's virtue, is Portia virtuous based on the text? Like, yeah, she is virtuous, but the way that the text, this is not Scott's reading, this is my reflections on this article as well as what you brought to the episode. But like the way that Shakespeare writes Portia as virtuous, I think textually she is virtuous based on the world of Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
But the afterlife of Julius Caesar, modern readers and modern theater makers and modern audiences have trouble understanding that virtue. And so they grapple with it and try to like refigure Portia's virtue to make her virtuous, but not in the way that Shakespeare wrote her as virtuous.
Yeah. And I think we see the same thing with the other side of the coin to Brutus, which is that, you know, the choice to make Brutus the most noble, a fall from grace archetype, when that's not necessarily what's in the text. And he's always sort of like false in how he presents his, you know, our presentation is not who he is on the inside the entire time. But there's this like desire or this decision that's repeatedly made to make him someone who is, like we see with Macbeth, of like, here is the most noble human, and then we're going to watch an entire story of how Macbeth, you know, falls to his demise. Or Othello as well. Like, let's watch somebody who is set up at the beginning to be virtuous, known to be honorable, and we see them be that, and then they are manipulated. This is like somebody who Brutus is often depicted in that same parallel of like, he is somebody who is noble and who is honorable, and then ends up with the wrong crowd and being manipulated by Cassius when really he's not honorable the entire time. So while Brutus has been elided and like sort of shorthanded into, or oversimplified, his honor has been oversimplified and like spread a little bit more, like he's given more honor than necessarily he has. Portia is often having her virtue reinterpreted and reconfigured instead of just it being what she is, to try and make her virtue align with the virtue of the people who are writing, reading, or producing her.
Yeah, it does. Basically what you're saying is that Brutus is given this pass by society. Portia's got to work extra hard to be seen as virtuous.
Yeah. When it's like, no, she, in the text, she is virtuous. These are things she does to prove her virtue. It makes sense in her society. And Brutus is not honorable, and he is trying to put on a show that he is trying to achieve honor the entire time.
Yeah. Is Brutus an honorable man?
I would like to see him be not so honorable in a future production. I would like to see him trying to be. He is trying to be. He doesn't know that he's not. What do you think? We definitely agree that Portia is virtuous through and through.
I think that Brutus is not an honorable man, and I think that's fascinating. I think it's way more interesting within this play to have Brutus be not honorable, either because he knows he's not being honorable and he's putting on a facade just because, or because, as you said, he's trying and he's just not living up to it, but everyone else thinks that he is honorable. That is so much more interesting.
Yes, that is so much more interesting than just like perfect Brutus. It makes him more, to me, a perfect foil for Antony, who is not pretending to be perfect and who's not pretending to be above emotion. And yeah, I agree. I don't think he's a perfect example of an honorable man. And I want to see, and I think it makes it much more interesting for him to be grappling with how he knows he falls short.
Yeah.
And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare, anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From Cymbeline, Act 3, Scene 5, said by Queen. "'Tis not sleepy business, but must be looked to speedily and strongly."